$15. A crumpled bill in the pocket of a starving mother on Christmas Eve. That was all that stood between her two little girls and hunger. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had no home, no husband, and no one left to turn to. The men who destroyed her life were still out there, hunting her, watching, waiting. And then the diner door opened, and every voice in the room went dead silent. The man who walked in was no stranger to violence. He was the head of the most powerful crime family in the city. But when he looked across the room and saw a trembling woman with two 5-year-old girls pressed against her, when he noticed the empty space on the table where her own plate should have been, something shifted inside him. He sat down across from her. He heard her story, and by the time she whispered the names of the men who had terrorized her, he had already made his decision. Some of those men would not live to see another sunrise. This story will remind you that kindness can come from the most unexpected places, and that one moment of courage from a stranger can change a family's life forever. If this story grabs you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. I have another powerful story waiting for you tomorrow. And before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let us dive in. Juliana Molina no longer remembered the feeling of being safe. Just 6 months prior, her place in the world was certain. It was in a little house on Maple Street, a place with peeling blue shutters and a wooden front porch that always groaned under your weight. It was in a cozy bed beside her husband, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing in the quiet darkness. It was a life that had its struggles, but it was completely and totally hers. Now, absolutely nothing was left. She had no home, no money in the bank, and no husband. All she had were two small daughters, who still looked at their mother as if she could shield them from anything. She was huddled in the corner booth of the restaurant. The zipper on her worn, olive-green jacket was pulled all the way up to her chin. The air inside was thick and warm, making her skin damp with sweat, but she could not bring herself to take it off. The shirt she wore underneath was thin and covered in old stains. She could not bear the thought of anyone seeing it. Chloe was pressed tightly into her left side, her little hands folded neatly on her lap. Palmer sat to her right, her eyes fixed on the menu that Juliana's shaking fingers could barely hold. Both girls were dressed in flimsy beige sweaters that were once plush but now were covered in small balls of fabric and frayed at the elbows. Their blonde hair was flat and needed combing. Their faces were pale, and their eyes seemed far too large, too aware for children their age. They understood they should not ask for things. They understood that their mother's quiet tears were a signal of approaching trouble. Juliana's gaze drifted over the slick, laminated menu, but the letters swam together. Her vision narrowed, and a knot formed in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She added the prices again and again, desperately trying to find a combination that would work. $15 was the only money she had in the world. She could afford 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, which she could divide between Chloe and Palmer. Perhaps she could also get a small glass of milk for each of them. That would leave her with a single dollar, maybe 2, for the tip if she was fortunate. She would not be eating. She had not eaten anything for 2 days. The hunger pangs in her stomach had faded hours ago. All that remained was a constant, dull ache that she had trained herself to push away. A waitress materialized at their table. She was a woman in her 50s, her graying hair secured in a tight bun, with eyes that looked as though nothing could ever surprise them. She took a small notepad from the pocket of her apron and clicked her pen. "What can I get for you, honey?" Juliana's throat felt squeezed shut. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The waitress stood there, waiting. Chloe glanced up at her mother. Palmer's tiny hand reached across the table and gently touched Juliana's arm. "Mama." Juliana willed herself to answer. Her voice was barely a whisper, thin and unsteady. "2 grilled cheese sandwiches, please, and 2 small milks." The waitress wrote the order down without making eye contact. "Anything for yourself?" No, just for them. The waitress stopped for a second. Her gaze moved to Juliana's face, taking in the pale skin, the deep exhaustion, and the dark bruises under her eyes from so many nights without sleep. She then looked at the twins, who were huddled against their mother like small, terrified creatures. For just a brief moment, a hint of softness flickered in the woman's eyes, but she offered no comment. She simply gave a short nod and turned away. Juliana let out a long, slow breath, her fingers still clenched around the menu's edge. She placed it back on the table with great care, as if it were made of delicate glass. Chloe leaned in closer to her. "Mama, are we going to our home tonight?" A sharp pain seized Juliana's chest. Home. They had no home. For the last 3 weeks, they had been living in a dilapidated motel at the edge of town. It was the sort of place where the carpet smelled of damp earth and the heater made a loud rattling noise through the night. She had used the last of the cash she earned cleaning houses to pay for 2 more nights there. She had no idea what they would do after that. "We will find a way, my sweet girl," Juliana whispered, gently moving a piece of hair from Chloe's forehead. "We always manage." But as the words left her mouth, her gaze shifted to the front door. It was not a look of hope, but one of deep fear. The men who had taken every single thing from her, the ones who had emptied her living room while her daughters sobbed, were still somewhere out there. They had promised her with chilling clarity that they would not stop until she settled her husband's debt. The problem was, she had nothing left that they could possibly take. Her husband, David, had passed away 6 months ago. He suffered a massive heart attack at only 34 years old. It was sudden, cruel, and absolute. 2 weeks after his funeral, she discovered he had borrowed a large sum of money from men who operated far outside the law. These were men who had no interest in widows, children, or tragic stories. She had attempted to plead with them, begging for a payment plan. She promised them she would find work, sell what little she had left, and do absolutely anything required. They turned her down flat. "A debt does not disappear just because a man does," one of them had stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And compassion is not part of our business." They seized the house, all the furniture, David's collection of tools, and even the clothes from his closet. And when Juliana had asked what would happen if she could not find the money, the man had leaned toward her and offered a cold smile. "In that case, we will take something else." She knew precisely what he was suggesting, so she fled. She grabbed the twins, gathered any cash she could conceal, and vanished into the unforgiving world. But she always knew they were searching for her. She felt it like a constant stare on her back, like a shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision. She could never remain in one place for very long. She could not form friendships. She could not place her trust in anyone. Her entire existence was now focused on getting through just one more day. The diner's door swung open once more. Juliana's head shot up, and her entire body tensed. But it was only an older couple, wrapped in heavy coats and scarves, smiling as they brushed snowflakes from their clothing. She let out a shaky breath and looked down at her own hands. They were visibly trembling. Chloe saw it. The little girl slid her small hand into Juliana's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "It will be okay, Mama," she whispered. A lump formed in Juliana's throat. She squeezed her daughter's hand in return, unable to find her voice. The food was delivered a few minutes later. 2 perfectly golden grilled cheese sandwiches had been sliced into neat triangles. They were served with 2 small glasses of milk, each with a colorful straw. The twins' faces immediately brightened. The sight broke Juliana's heart. "Go on, my babies," she managed to say. "You can eat." Chloe and Palmer needed no further encouragement. They each picked up a sandwich with both hands and took a large, hungry bite, a string of melted cheese stretching between their little fingers. Juliana just watched them, her eyes growing misty again. This was the only thing she had in the world. This single moment, in this booth. with these two precious girls who still had faith that she could rescue them. And at that exact moment, the door opened again. A sharp gust of frigid air rushed into the diner, and everything came to a complete halt. The man who entered the room was tall, with broad shoulders, and wore a black suit that likely cost more than Juliana had earned in the past year. His long, dark hair was combed back from a face composed of sharp lines and icy self-control. Intricate tattoos crept up from the collar of his shirt, dark patterns that hinted at a life of violence and authority. Following him, 4 other men stepped inside, moving in silence. They were watchful, and all of them were dressed in black. The diner was plunged into an unnerving silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to move. The air in Juliana's lungs felt trapped. She knew this kind of quiet. She had heard it fill her own living room. It was the sound that arrived when the men came to take her life apart. And now, here it was on Christmas Eve, with no escape left. One of those men had just found her. Adriano Silva never had to introduce himself. His very presence announced who he was. He stood just past the threshold, snowflakes slowly melting on the fabric of his expensive black suit. His dark eyes swept across the room with the unhurried, sharp focus of a predator surveying his domain. Behind him, his 4 associates spread out just enough to be noticed. Their posture was not hostile or overtly menacing, they were simply there. They were silent guardians who knew that their leader did not require protection, but merely observation. The diner was frozen in time. An old man's fork stopped halfway to his open mouth. A young couple was stuck in the middle of a sentence, a coffee mug suspended just above its saucer. Even the waitress, who had been in the middle of refilling water glasses, was completely still, her pitcher tilted but no longer pouring. No one made eye contact with Adriano, but every single person was aware of him. Juliana felt a crushing weight on her chest. Her hand moved on its own, covering Chloe's and pressing her daughter's fingers firmly to the tabletop. Palmer paused with food in her mouth, her eyes huge with confusion. "Mama," Palmer whispered. "Shush," Juliana breathed, the sound so faint it was nearly non-existent. "Do not move." She was intimately familiar with this silence. She had endured it before. It was the moment when truly dangerous men walked into a space and seemed to steal all the oxygen from it. It was the moment when regular people were rendered insignificant, invisible, becoming nothing more than living furniture that happened to have a pulse. Her insides twisted into a painful knot. "Please, do not let them be here for me. Please, not now. Not in front of my children." Adriano's gaze passed systematically over the diner's occupants. He registered the elderly couple tucked into a corner, the young family seated by the window, and the solitary truck driver at the counter with his black coffee. His eyes evaluated each person with the same dispassionate focus, cataloging them, judging them, and then casting them aside. And then, his eyes settled on Juliana. She felt his stare like a physical force. She completely stopped breathing. For 3 full, agonizing seconds, Adriano Silva observed the woman in the faded olive jacket, her unkempt blonde hair framing a face etched with fear and deep weariness. He noted the 2 small girls who were clinging to her sides, like small birds trying to find shelter beneath a damaged wing. He saw the half-finished grilled cheese sandwiches and the 2 small, nearly empty glasses of milk. His eyes landed on the bare space of tabletop where her dinner plate should have been. The absence of food was a statement, and in that moment, something changed in his gaze. A cold, analytical awareness settled deep within him. Just as quickly, he looked away. Relief washed over Juliana, so potent it made her feel dizzy. She gripped the table's edge to keep from swaying, her knuckles turning bone white from the pressure. Adriano Silva moved with purpose deeper into the diner, his men trailing behind him like loyal shadows. He selected a booth near the rear of the room. It was not the darkest corner, but it offered a clear view of every entrance and every person. One of his men slid into the seat opposite him. The other three took up positions around the small restaurant. They were statues, silent and watchful, not blocking any exits but owning the space completely. A collective breath was released. The low hum of conversation slowly returned, but now it was hushed and careful. The sound of cutlery on ceramic seemed unnaturally loud. The waitress began to move again, her steps hesitant as she walked toward Adriano's table, a tremor in her hands. "Coffee," Adriano stated, his voice cutting through the quiet before she could even ask. His voice was not loud, but it held a quiet authority that filled the entire room. "Black. And get yourself whatever she is having." He motioned with his head toward the waitress. The young woman blinked, her expression a mask of confusion. I am sorry, sir. You have not taken a break all evening." This was not a question, it was a declaration. "Order some food for yourself. I am covering the cost." The waitress just stood there, her mouth opening and then closing, unable to form a word. Adriano's expression remained unchanged, a flat, hard mask. That was not a request. "I thank you," she finally managed to stammer, scurrying away toward the kitchen before he could add anything else. Juliana forced her gaze down to her own children. Chloe had resumed eating her meal, but her motions were robotic and stiff. Palmer, ever the nervous one, had stopped eating entirely. She was still staring at the men in their dark suits, her sandwich completely forgotten in her tiny hands. "Palmer," Juliana whispered, her voice a soft plea as she gently guided her daughter's face back to her. "Please eat, sweetie. Everything is okay." But it was not okay. It was far from okay, because from his booth across the diner, Adriano Silva was watching them once more. He was not obvious about it, but Juliana could feel the weight of his stare. She had grown new senses over the last 6 months. They were the raw instincts of survival, the kind that screamed at her when true danger was close. Right now, every single nerve ending in her body was alight with warning. She watched from the very corner of her vision as Adriano raised his coffee cup to his lips. It was black, with no sugar, precisely how he had ordered it. He took a deliberate, slow sip from the mug. His eyes, however, were in constant motion. He saw the young couple who paid their bill and fled into the night. He saw the truck driver who stole a nervous glance at him in the mirror behind the counter. He saw the old man who whispered to his wife, prompting her to grip his hand with more force. Fear was an unmistakable scent in the air, and Adriano Silva had learned to recognize its every variation long ago. But something else held his focus. It was the woman in the worn olive jacket. She had barely shifted since his arrival. Her entire body was a shield, angled to protect her two small children. Her shoulders were hunched, a subconscious effort to shrink, to disappear. And her eyes, those exhausted and terrified eyes, were not on him. They kept darting toward the front door. Not at his men, but at the door itself, as if she were waiting for a different monster to arrive. Adriano placed his coffee cup back on the saucer with a quiet click. He had seen that exact look countless times before. It was the look of an animal being hunted down. It was the expression of someone who understood that safety was nothing more than a temporary illusion, and that at any second the door could swing open and reveal their absolute worst nightmare. He leaned back in the vinyl booth, his fingers tapping a single sharp rhythm against the table. It was a silent command. One of his men, a powerfully built enforcer named Rico, immediately stepped nearer. "Boss?" Adriano did not bother to look at him. His focus remained locked on Juliana's table. "The woman, in the corner booth. Do you see her?" Rico followed his boss's line of sight. "Yeah, I see her. She is scared. Everyone gets scared when you come in, boss." "No." Adriano's voice became even quieter, more intense. "She was already afraid long before I walked through that door." Rico remained silent, waiting for his orders. Adriano watched as Juliana's hand slipped into her jacket pocket to touch something hidden there, her fingers closing around the object to check on it, to reassure herself that it had not vanished. The motion was automatic, a nervous habit she probably did not even notice. He recognized that gesture as well, People who constantly checked their money did so for one of two reasons. They were either suffocating under poverty, or they were drowning in debt. Frequently, it was both. She ordered meals for her children, Adriano said, his voice a low murmur. She ordered nothing for herself. Maybe she is not hungry, Rico offered. She is starving. A muscle in Adriano's jaw twitched. Look at her hands. Look at the lines on her face. She has not had a proper meal in days. Rico shifted his considerable weight from one foot to the other. Do you want me to do something? No, Adriano interrupted him sharply. Not yet. But his eyes never left her, because Adriano Silva did not build his entire empire by dismissing his gut feelings. And at that moment, every instinct he possessed was screaming that the terrified woman in the corner booth was not simply poor. She was running for her life. And whoever she was running from, they were the kind of people Adriano understood intimately. Juliana could feel his gaze on her. She did not understand how she knew, because she was not looking at him, had not dared to look at him since that first terrifying moment their eyes had connected. But she felt it all the same. The sheer weight of his attention was a physical pressure against her skin. Her fingers shook as she reached out to steady Palmer's glass of milk, preventing her daughter from accidentally knocking it over. Be careful, baby, she whispered. Chloe had already finished her entire sandwich. Now she sat perfectly still, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyelids heavy with a deep exhaustion. Palmer was still picking at her food, chewing slowly, her movements sluggish and drowsy. What they needed was sleep. They needed a warm, safe bed and the kind of security that Juliana was completely unable to provide for them. Her eyes fell upon the bill the waitress had placed face down on the table. A knot of acid formed in her stomach. She did not want to turn it over. She was terrified to see the number printed there, the number that would confirm if her careful calculations were correct, or if she would face the ultimate humiliation. Having to send food back. Having to ask the kitchen to split a single meal between two hungry girls. Having to beg strangers for a shred of mercy. Her hand trembled uncontrollably as she finally reached for it. Do not. The voice was so close it made her flinch. Juliana's head shot up, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Adriano Silva was standing right beside her booth. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his slacks, his face a neutral, unreadable mask. Seeing him this close, he was even more intimidating. He was taller than she had realized, broader, and his presence seemed to consume all the air around them. The tattoos that snaked up his neck were intricate and dark, designs that were not merely decorative. They were the kind that told a story, a history written with ink, pain, and violence. Juliana's throat felt like it was full of sand. She could not make the words come out. I am so sorry. Do not touch the check, Adriano repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. It did not need volume to command obedience. Juliana snatched her hand back as if the paper had scorched her fingertips. I did not. I was not going to. She knew she was babbling, but she could not seem to stop the flow of panicked words. Chloe and Palmer both huddled closer to their mother, their small faces turned up to stare at the towering man in the black suit. Chloe's lower lip began to quiver. Palmer's eyes were huge saucers of confusion and fear. Adriano's gaze dropped to the two girls, and for a fraction of a second, an emotion she could not identify flickered across his face. Then his dark eyes were back on Juliana. Where is your husband? The question struck Juliana with the force of a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She closed it, then tried again. He is... Her throat sealed itself shut completely. Adriano simply waited. He did not push her for an answer or repeat the question. He just stood there, exuding an aura of infinite, unnerving patience, his gaze steady and unwavering. Juliana felt the hot sting of tears welling up behind her eyes. She fought to swallow them back, to maintain some small piece of her composure, but the words finally escaped in a broken, ragged whisper. He is gone. The diner was filled with a sudden, profound silence. He died, she added, her voice barely audible, 6 months ago. The world around her seemed to recede. The other patrons, the clatter of plates, the faint sound of Christmas music from a radio, all of it dissolved into a distant, meaningless hum. Adriano's expression did not soften, but the muscle in his jaw tightened once more. "How old are they?" he asked, nodding toward the twins. 5? Juliana's voice was a fragile thing, ready to shatter. "They just turned 5 last month." Adriano looked at Chloe and Palmer again, and this time he truly saw them. He saw 2 little girls with golden hair and terrified eyes. He saw them wearing sweaters that were far too thin for a cold winter night. He saw them sitting in a cheap diner on Christmas Eve with a mother who clearly could not even afford to buy herself a meal. Deep inside his pockets, his hands, unseen, curled slowly into tight, angry fists. "What happened to him?" Adriano asked, his voice now even quieter, almost gentle. "A heart attack?" Juliana swiped at her wet eyes with the back of her hand. "The doctors told me it was very sudden. They said he did not suffer." "But you did." It was a statement, not a question. Juliana's breath hitched in her throat. She could only nod, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. Adriano pulled out the chair from her table and sat down across from her, not waiting for an invitation. His men stayed where they were, watching everything but keeping their distance. This close, Juliana could see the fine details of his face. The darkness had hidden the thin white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of past violence. He wore a silver ring on his right hand. His eyes were not simply dark. They felt like they could see every fear she had ever known. Adriano's voice was quiet but firm. "Tell me what happened after he passed away." It was a command, not a question. Juliana's hands clenched together in her lap, a knot of white knuckles and trembling fingers. "I cannot," she whispered. "I truly should not." He simply said, "Tell me." There was an authority in his tone that had nothing to do with how loud he spoke. It was an undercurrent of absolute power, and it shattered her defenses. The story tumbled out of her in a rush. "David, my husband, he needed to borrow money." Her voice was a fragile thread of sound. "He wanted to buy a delivery truck for a new business. He dreamed of starting his own company, you see. He kept saying it would change our lives, that it would give our girls a future." She took a shaky breath, a shudder running through her. "He did not go to a bank. He borrowed from certain men." Adriano's face was unreadable. "I understand the type of men you mean." Juliana nodded, hot tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "After he died, they appeared. It was only 2 weeks. I never even knew about the loan. David had never told me anything. They had no sympathy. The fact that my husband was gone meant nothing to them. They showed no concern for Chloe and Palmer, my little girls. All they cared about was getting their money." Her voice began to climb, shaking with a frantic energy. "I pleaded with them. I promised I would find a way to pay them back. I told them I would get a job. Not just one, but 2 or even 3 jobs, if that is what it took. I asked them if I could make smaller payments over time. I just begged them, please, just give me some time." Adriano's gaze was intense. "And what was their response?" Juliana's expression collapsed into pure despair. "They told me that a debt does not die when a man does." Her voice fell to a broken, hollow whisper. "They said mercy was not a currency they accepted." A muscle tightened in Adriano's jaw, a visible sign of a powerful, contained anger. "They began to take everything," Juliana went on, the words flowing like a torrent of pain. "They took the house, all the furniture, David's collection of tools from the garage, even his clothes. They took things that were his, that were ours, things that made up our family's life. They took it all. And then I asked them what would happen if I still could not pay what was left. One of them, she halted, her entire body trembling violently. The silence stretched. One of them did what? Adriano's voice was now dangerously soft as he gave her a faint, cold smile. Juliana lifted her head, her eyes wide with a remembered terror. He smiled, just like that, and he said they would just have to take something else of value. A chilling pause filled the air. And then he looked directly at my daughters. The warm air in the diner suddenly felt ice cold, dropping by 10 degrees. Adriano remained perfectly still, not a muscle moving, but his eyes transformed. They became hard, lethal, and utterly without mercy. Names, he said, his voice a soft command. What do you mean? She stammered. Give me their names. Juliana's eyes grew wider, filled with panic. I cannot do that. If they discover I spoke to someone. They will not discover anything, Adriano assured her, leaning forward just an inch. Names. And before Juliana's fear could force her back into silence, before her mind could scream at her to protect herself, she found herself whispering two names across the small table. They were just names to her, sounds in the dark. But to Adriano Silva, they meant everything. They were men he knew, men who operated within his sphere of influence. They were men who had broken the cardinal rules, men who had just signed their own death warrant. Greor and Tommy, Juliana whispered, her voice almost inaudible. I don't know Greor's last name, but Tommy. His name is Tommy. Rudo. The second she uttered the name, a wave of profound regret washed over her. Adriano's expression did not alter in the slightest. There was no visible reaction, no twitch of a muscle. Yet the very atmosphere around him seemed to change, growing dense and heavy with a dark, suffocating pressure. One of the men standing behind him, the one she heard called Rico, made a nearly invisible shift in his stance. Another man shared a brief, knowing look with his companion. It was a silent conversation that Juliana could not interpret, but she felt its meaning deep in her bones. These names were known to them. They visited me 3 separate times, Juliana said, the words now unstoppable. The first visit was just 2 weeks after the funeral. They were almost polite. They informed me that David owed them $43,000. They demanded the full amount right then and there. Her hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles turning a stark white. I did not have that kind of money. I had $300 to my name in our checking account. David's life insurance policy was delayed for months because of the investigation into his death. I showed them everything I had, the bank statements, the stack of unpaid bills. I showed them proof of my situation. I begged them to just wait. Adriano's voice was a mask of perfect calm, completely controlled. But beneath that surface, Juliana sensed a dangerous current that made her throat feel tight. They told me they would return in 1 week. And when they came back, they brought a large truck with them, her voice fractured. They started taking our things. They took our couch, the dining room table, the television, and all of David's tools from the garage. He loved those tools so much. He was so proud of them. Then they went into my daughter's room and took their bunk beds while Chloe and Palmer stood there and watched. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. The third time they came, they had legal documents. They said our house had been used as collateral for the loan. They claimed David had signed the deed over to them. I had no idea. He never once mentioned that he had gambled with our family home. Adriano's fingers tapped the table once. It was a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in the quiet diner. How much is the remaining balance they claim you owe? Juliana let out a laugh that was bitter and completely broken. They say I still owe everything. They took possession of the house, but they claimed its value was not enough to cover the debt. They said David had borrowed far more than what they recovered. They told me I still owed $28,000, she said, her voice rising with the sheer injustice of it all. It was for a truck loan, for the very truck that was taken back by the lender a week after David died. Can you believe that? They repossessed the truck. They seized our home. They stripped us of everything we ever owned. And after all that, they still insist that I owe them more money. Adriano slowly leaned back in the booth, his intense gaze fixed on her face. When was their most recent visit? 4 days ago, Juliana whispered, her voice trembling with terror. Somehow they found the motel where we were staying. I have no idea how they located us. I was being so careful. But Tommy knocked on our door at 2 in the morning. He did not have to say a word to threaten me. He did not need to. He just stood in the doorway and said, "We know where you are now, and we will always know where to find you." Her whole body was shaking. I packed our bags in 10 minutes. We left in the middle of the night. We have been on the move every single day since then. We sleep in the car mostly, or we find a shelter when one has room. I absolutely cannot let them find us again. Chloe made a small, choked sound beside her, a tiny whimper she tried to stifle. Palmer pressed her face tightly against her mother's side. Her mother's arm provided little comfort. Adriano's focus shifted to the two small girls, and for a brief, fleeting instant, something profoundly human flickered in the depths of his eyes. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. "These men you mentioned," Adriano said, choosing his words with care, "Greor and Tommy, did they ever tell you who they work for?" Juliana shook her head. "No, they only said they were collecting on a debt that was owed to them and that they had every right to it." "They do not have that right." The statement was spoken so softly that Juliana almost did not hear him. "What did you say?" Adriano's eyes met hers, and they were like chips of cold stone. "They do not have the right, not to take your home, not to take your late husband's personal belongings, and they most certainly do not have the right to terrorize a grieving widow and her young children." Juliana could only stare at him, her mind a battlefield of confusion and a desperate, rising hope. "I do not understand what you mean. How can you—" "Because men of their kind operate according to a specific set of rules." Adriano's voice was now frigid and precise. "And these two men have just broken every single one of them." He reached inside his tailored jacket. Juliana flinched away from the movement. He pulled out a fine leather wallet, opened it, and removed a thick stack of bills. He placed them on the table without even counting them. It was $300. Juliana's eyes widened in disbelief. I cannot accept this. I can't take your money." "This is not for you," Adriano said, gently pushing the cash toward her. He nodded his head toward Chloe and Palmer. "It is for them. Go and buy them proper winter coats, some new clothes, and find a safe, warm place for them to sleep tonight." "But I cannot possibly—" Adriano reached over and picked up the small paper check the waitress had left on the table. He barely glanced at the total of $14.76 before pulling out another $50 bill from his wallet. He placed both the check and the large bill near the edge of the table for the waitress. Then, his hand moved across the table, and he gently pushed Juliana's own crumpled $15 bill back to her. "You keep this," he said with simple finality. Juliana's hands flew to her mouth as a powerful sob finally broke through her control. It was a raw, desperate sound, filled with 6 months of accumulated terror, grief, and utter exhaustion. "Why?" she managed to ask through her tears. "Why are you doing this for us? You do not even know who we are." Adriano stood up from the booth, his movements slow and deliberate as he buttoned his suit jacket. "Because I know what it feels like to watch your own mother go without food so that you could eat." "I understand that feeling," he said quietly. "And I know what kind of men Greor and Tommy are. I know exactly what they represent." He looked down at her, and in that moment, Juliana saw something in his eyes that made her heart stop. It was not pity. It was a deep and profound understanding. "They will not bother you again," Adriano stated, his voice a promise. Juliana's own voice trembled as she asked, "How? How can you possibly know that for certain?" Adriano leaned down, lowering his voice so that only she could hear his next words. Because men like that continue to exist only for as long as I permit them to. The blood in Juliana's veins turned to ice. It was not a chill of fear, but one of sudden, stark realization. She finally understood. She understood what he was, who he was, and what her whispered words, those two simple names, had set in motion. Do not say anything else, Adriano said, straightening up. Just take your daughters somewhere safe for the night. Make sure they are warm. Buy them another meal. And tomorrow? He paused for a moment. Tomorrow, I will ensure that you never have to run from anyone, ever again. Before Juliana could even think of a reply, Adriano turned and began to walk toward the exit. His men immediately fell into formation around him, moving like silent, coordinated shadows. But he stopped just before he reached the heavy glass door. He turned his head just slightly, not to look back at her, but as if he were listening for something. One more thing, he called out across the now quiet diner. Juliana's voice was barely more than a whisper. Yes? Where will you be staying tonight? I I do not know yet. I was planning to try and find a room. The Riverside Motel, Adriano said, his tone leaving no possibility for debate. It is 3 blocks north of here. Go to room 212. The room has been paid for. You can stay for 1 week, and no one will ask you any questions. I cannot accept that. You can. Adriano's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. And you will do it. For them. He then pushed open the door and stepped out into the swirling snow. For a long moment, the diner remained suspended in silence after his departure. Then, slowly, the low hum of conversation started up again. Dishes clinked in the kitchen. The faint sound of Christmas music continued to play, but Juliana sat completely frozen in her booth, her eyes fixed on the $300 on the table and the $15 he had so kindly returned to her. Through the frosted glass of the window, she could just make out Adriano's dark figure standing beside a black car, speaking quietly into a telephone. His expression was perfectly calm, but his eyes held the promise of cold vengeance. Juliana felt completely frozen. She remained in the booth, staring at the pile of bills on the table, as if they might disappear if she blinked. $300. It was more cash than she had held in her hands in the entire time since David had died. It was more than enough to feed her daughters for several weeks. It was more than enough to offer a moment of peace. Mama? Chloe's tiny voice snapped her out of her trance. Juliana looked down and saw both of her daughters looking up at her, their eyes wide with worry and confusion. Palmer's little hand was still clenched tightly around her arm. Chloe's bottom lip was trembling again. Is the scary man gone? Palmer whispered. Juliana opened her mouth to say yes, to reassure her, but the words stuck in her throat. Was he a scary man? Yes. He was absolutely terrifying. He was a nightmare made real. But he had also just shown them a kindness greater than anyone had in 6 long months. He is gone, baby, Juliana finally said, her voice soft. He is not going to hurt us. Are you sure? Chloe asked, and the smallness of her voice was enough to shatter Juliana's heart. Juliana gathered both of her girls into a tight embrace, pressing gentle kisses into their hair. I'm positive they will be. But even as the words left her mouth, her gaze was drawn back to the frosty window. Adriano was still out there, a dark figure standing next to a gleaming black car with his phone held tight against his ear. Even from this distance, through the distorted glass, she could see the unyielding tension in his shoulders, the cold fury that radiated from his very posture. He was making phone calls, and Juliana knew with a deep, gut-level instinct that those calls were about Gregor and Tommy. A shiver traced a path down her spine, but it was not from fear. It was something entirely different, something she did not dare put a name to. Hope felt far too reckless. But maybe, just maybe, it was possibility. A waitress approached their table with a careful hesitation, her eyes flicking from Juliana to the money. She picked up the $50 bill and the receipt. But then she paused. "He is very generous," she stated cautiously, as if she were trying the word out for the first time. Juliana was at a complete loss for how to reply. The waitress glanced at the twins, then her eyes returned to Juliana, her expression softening into something like pity. "You know, those grilled cheese sandwiches seemed a little on the small side. What if I were to bring out a side of fries for you all? Perhaps some hot chocolate for the girls as well." "I simply cannot," Juliana began to say, her voice cracking. "It is on the house." The waitress's tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. "It is Christmas Eve. No child should be hungry on Christmas Eve." Before Juliana could even think of another protest, the woman had turned on her heel and walked back toward the kitchen. Chloe and Palmer shot each other a look, their tired eyes finally lighting up with a spark for the first time that whole long night. "Hot chocolate?" Palmer whispered the words, as if they held some kind of powerful magic. "And French fries?" Chloe added in a hushed, reverent tone. Juliana felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill over again. She blinked them back with a furious determination. "Yes, my babies. Hot chocolate and fries." The twins broke into genuine smiles, not the terrified, shaky expressions they had been wearing for what felt like an eternity. Juliana felt something shatter deep inside her chest. When was the last time she had witnessed them smile with such pure, uncomplicated joy? 10 minutes later, their little table was laden with food. A basket overflowing with golden French fries, 2 large mugs of rich hot chocolate crowned with whipped cream, and delicate chocolate shavings. And because the waitress was apparently a woman who could not do things by halves, 3 generous slices of apple pie, still radiating warmth from the oven. "This is for all of you," the waitress said with clear intention, placing a fork directly in front of Juliana. "And I expect to see that fork has been used by the time I come back this way." Juliana could only stare at the slice of pie, her stomach a battlefield where gnawing hunger and overwhelming guilt waged a terrible war. "Mama, you need to eat something," Chloe insisted gently. "The nice lady said you had to." "That is right, Mama," Palmer echoed her sister, already happily dipping a long, crispy fry into a small puddle of ketchup. "You have to eat." Juliana looked at her 2 daughters. At their faces now flushed with warmth and comfort, their eyes shining with a light she had feared was extinguished forever. She saw their small hands reaching eagerly for food they did not have to count or save, and with a shaky breath, she finally picked up the fork. The first bite of apple pie was so sweet it was almost a shock. Her stomach, which had grown unaccustomed to real sustenance, clenched in protest. But she made herself swallow, and then she took a second bite, and then a third. Chloe and Palmer watched her every move, and the relief that washed over their small faces was unmistakable. "You are not going. You are starting to disappear, Mama," Chloe said with a quiet voice. Juliana's hand paused in midair, a piece of food just inches from her lips. "What did you say, baby?" "You just keep getting lighter," Palmer chimed in. Her tone was so practical, as if she were describing the weather. "Like a strong gust of wind might just carry you away." A knot formed in Juliana's throat, making it impossible to breathe. Oh God! They had seen it. Of course, they had seen how much she was wasting away. "I am not going anywhere," she managed to whisper, her voice fierce with a desperate promise. "I promise you both, I am right here with you." The twins nodded, their simple fears eased, and went back to their French fries and warm drinks. But Juliana could not command her own body to stop crying. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks while she forced herself to eat. From a booth near the back of the diner, a few other customers watched the quiet family drama. An older woman leaned over to her husband. "That is the table he stopped at before he left," she whispered to him. "The man who was wearing that black suit." Her husband nodded slowly in agreement. "I saw it happen. Why would a man like that help them?" The old man considered the question for a long, quiet moment. Then he finally spoke. Because men like that do not forget the feeling of being hungry, he said. They carry that memory with them forever. His wife looked over at Juliana and her girls, her eyes falling on the cash still sitting untouched on the table. I truly hope she takes it, she murmured softly. I hope she does not let her pride get in the way of that kindness. She will not, her husband answered with complete certainty. She has babies to care for. Pride does not feed babies. Outside the diner, Adriano concluded his phone call. He stood motionless in the gently falling snow, his eyes staring blankly into the distance. Rico approached him with caution. Boss, is everything all right? Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo, Adriano stated, his voice completely flat and empty of any feeling. They have been collecting money without my permission. They were running their own secret operation on the side, taking portions of money that never belonged to them in the first place. Rico's jaw clenched with anger. How long has this been going on? For at least a year, but it might have been even longer than that. Adriano's powerful hands slowly curled into tight, shaking fists. They have been preying on widows, he said, his voice laced with disgust. They targeted single mothers and people who were in no position to fight back. They went after anyone who did not know any better. My God, they are using our name to do it, Adriano went on, his voice dropping to a dangerously low growl. They are telling people that they work for me, that these false debts are officially sanctioned by our organization. Rico's entire expression darkened with a cold fury, mirroring the storm that was gathering inside his boss. Model. They are dead men walking. Not quite yet. Adriano finally turned to face his second-in-command fully. First, I need to know every single person who is involved in this. I want to know who has been looking the other way while they did this. I want to know who has been taking payments from them. And then, a smile spread across Adriano's face, but it was a cold and terrible thing, devoid of any warmth. Then, we are going to remind every single person in this city precisely why the rules exist in the first place. Rico gave a single, sharp nod. What do you want to do about the woman, Juliana? Adriano's gaze shifted back through the diner window. He could see Juliana now, eating her pie slowly while her daughters laughed over their mugs of hot chocolate. For the first time since he had laid eyes on her, her shoulders were not hunched over in terror. She will have protection, Adriano said in a quiet, firm voice. Around the clock. I do not care if she is aware of it or not. Nobody is to touch her. Nobody goes anywhere near those children. For how long should we watch her? For as long as this takes. Adriano's tone was final and absolute. Until Gregor and Tommy are properly handled. Until every single debt collector in this city understands exactly what happens when you decide to break my rules. Rico hesitated for a brief moment. Boss, she has kids. What if this blows back on her? It will not, Adriano stated, his eyes like chips of ice, filled with a cold certainty. It will not, because Gregor and Tommy will not live long enough to even consider retaliation. He pulled his phone from his pocket again and made another call. The person on the other end answered on the very first ring. It is me, Adriano said without preamble. I need you to find everything you can on Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo. Every single debt they have ever collected, every widow they have ever terrorized, every last dollar they have stolen from innocent people. He paused for a beat. And I need all of it on my desk by morning. He ended the call and stood silently in the snow, his gaze fixed on the diner as Juliana carefully folded the $300 and tucked the money safely into her jacket pocket. She looked up suddenly then, as if feeling his eyes on her, and her gaze found him through the glass. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the distance. Then, Juliana mouthed two silent words. Thank you. Adriano gave a single, almost imperceptible nod in return. Then he turned his back and walked away into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but a fresh set of footprints in the deepening snow. Juliana gathered her daughters close to her side as they finally stepped out of the diner, the wonderful warmth of the meal still radiating through their small, tired bodies. The snow had begun to fall much thicker now, blanketing the sidewalks in a pristine coat of white. The snow was falling thick and white, turning the Christmas lights into blurry streaks of color, like a memory of a painting. Chloe's small hand was a tight anchor in Juliana's own. In her other arm, Palmer clutched a paper bag containing a precious slice of leftover pie, a gift from the diner waitress. A piece of pie for breakfast tomorrow. The word tomorrow felt alien on her tongue, a concept she had not allowed herself to consider. For 6 long months, Juliana's world had shrunk to the next few hours, the desperate search for the next meal, the constant hunt for another safe place to sleep. But tonight was different. With $300 folded carefully in her pocket, and the key to a warm hotel room just 3 blocks away, the idea of a future suddenly felt real, almost within reach. She pulled her thin jacket tighter against the cold and urged her daughters forward. The streets were nearly empty. All the normal families were inside, safe in their warm homes, surrounded by the glow of Christmas trees, sharing presents and singing songs. Juliana fought to push away the memories, the ghost of last Christmas when David was still alive, when their own house was filled with warmth and love. She ordered herself to stop thinking, just keep moving. They had almost made it, just 2 blocks down, when a cold certainty washed over her. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Her pace faltered, and her fingers instinctively squeezed Chloe's hand until it was almost painful. Juliana risked a quick look over her shoulder, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw nothing out of the ordinary. There were only empty sidewalks blanketed in fresh snow and the soft, silent flakes continuing to fall from the dark sky. Yet, the chilling sensation refused to leave. It clung to her like the winter air. She began to walk faster, her eyes darting everywhere, examining every deep shadow, the dark interior of every parked vehicle, the recessed gloom of every darkened doorway. "Mama," Chloe's voice was a tiny, frightened whisper beside her. "What is it?" Juliana forced a calm she did not feel. "It is nothing, baby. We are almost to the hotel." But her heart was a frantic drum inside her chest. As they rounded the corner onto Riverside Avenue, the inn came into view. It was a simple 2-story structure with a bright neon sign that hummed in the night, its red letters spelling out the beautiful word, vacancy. A wave of profound relief washed over her. They were so close, just a little farther. It was then that the solid sound of a car door opening just behind them cut through the quiet night. Juliana went completely still. Her blood felt like it had turned to ice as she heard heavy footsteps crunching deliberately through the snow. They were steady, they were unhurried, and they were getting closer. "No," she thought. "Please no. Not when we are this close to safety." She spun around, shoving Chloe and Palmer behind her small frame, preparing herself to run, to scream, to do whatever it took. A large man emerged from the darkness, stepping directly into the yellow glow of a nearby streetlight. He was tall and wore a long black coat, a man with dark skin who was built so solidly he looked like he could snap a person in half with very little effort. Juliana knew who he was in an instant. He was one of Adriano's people. "Mrs. Molina," the man's voice was surprisingly calm and even. "My name is Rico. I am an employee of Mr. Silva." Juliana's breathing became shallow, coming in quick, panicked puffs of white in the cold air. "What is it you want from us?" Rico slowly raised both of his large hands, showing her that he held no weapon and meant no immediate harm. "Mr. Silva sent me. He wanted to ensure that you and your daughters arrived at the inn without any trouble." Juliana stared at him, bewildered. "He what?" Rico's expression grew serious. "You have been followed," he stated, his voice low and direct. "Not by us. By them." Juliana felt a new wave of fear, a cold dread that settled deep in her stomach. Gregor and Tommy. Rico seemed to read her mind, his face hardening. Not those two themselves, but they have men watching. They have eyes on all these streets. Mr. Silva wants to be certain that they do not get anywhere close to you or your children. Juliana's gaze shifted past the imposing figure of Rico to the black sedan that was now idling silently by the curb. Its windows were tinted dark, and its engine purred with a quiet power. "How long have you been following us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Since the moment you left the diner," Rico answered, his tone factual, not apologetic in the least. "And we will continue to follow you until the situation is properly handled." Juliana was trapped between a dizzying sense of relief and a profound, bone-deep terror. She did not know which emotion was stronger. "Where is he?" she began to ask, but the words caught in her throat. She found she could not complete the question, unable to form the words to ask what a man like Adriano was planning to do to solve her problem. Rico seemed to understand her unspoken fear. "Mr. Silva has his own way of taking care of his problems. That is everything you need to know." He then gestured with his head toward the entrance of the inn. "You should go inside now. Your room is number 212. It is already paid for. Everything has been arranged for you." Rico's gaze was steady and serious. "Tomorrow morning, there will be a man stationed outside your door. You will not be able to see him, but I promise you, he will be there." Juliana's mind was racing, trying to make sense of this impossible situation. "For how long will he be there?" she asked. "For as long as it is necessary," he replied. Juliana just stared at him, overwhelmed. "Why is he doing any of this? We mean nothing to him." Rico's expression softened for just a moment. "You reminded him of something," he interrupted her gently. "Something from his past that he works very hard to forget." Before Juliana could ask him to explain what he meant, Rico gave a single sharp nod and turned, walking back to the waiting sedan. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb and vanished into the snowy darkness. Juliana remained frozen on the sidewalk, her daughters clinging tightly to her sides, as she watched the red taillights fade into nothing. "Mama," Palmer's voice was small as she tugged on the fabric of her jacket. "Can we please go inside? I am very cold." Juliana finally looked down at her two girls, at their exhausted little faces and the unwavering hope that still shone in their eyes. In that moment, she made a firm decision. "Yes, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's go inside where it is warm." Room 212 was not large, but it was immaculately clean. Inside, there were two double beds piled high with thick, warm comforters, a small bathroom that had wonderfully hot water, a heater on the wall that actually worked, and a television mounted in the corner. To Juliana, who had spent months in squalor, it was the most beautiful palace she had ever seen. Chloe and Palmer immediately forgot their exhaustion and ran straight for the beds. They began bouncing up and down, their delighted laughter echoing brightly in the small, quiet space. "Mama, come and feel, they are so soft." Juliana stood just inside the doorway, a painful lump forming in her throat. How long had it been since her children had slept in real, comfortable beds? Had it been weeks? It felt more like months. She carefully closed the door behind them and secured every lock she could find. The deadbolt made a satisfying click, and the heavy chain slid firmly into place. Then, she walked over to the window and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain. The street below was now perfectly quiet and appeared empty, but she knew with absolute certainty that they were out there. Adriano's men were watching, standing guard, protecting them. And somewhere else in the sleeping city, Adriano himself was making phone calls, moving unseen pieces around a complicated chessboard that Juliana could not begin to comprehend. He was doing things she was certain she did not want to know about, all for her and for her girls. She let the curtain drop back into its place. An hour later, both of her daughters were sound asleep, curled up together in one of the large beds. Their small bodies were finally, truly relaxed, looking completely safe for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Juliana sat on the edge of the other bed, her eyes fixed on the $300 that was spread out on the nightstand beside her. It was real money, which meant real safety, and maybe, just maybe, real hope. But all of it had come from a dangerous man who existed in a world defined by violence and fear. This was a man who, with a single command over the telephone, could make other people simply disappear forever. Juliana knew with every fiber of her being that she should be terrified. The smart thing to do would be to pack up her daughters this very second and run as far away as she could. But she found that she could not move, because for the first time in half a year, Chloe and Palmer were sleeping without the shadow of fear haunting them. For the first time in 6 excruciating months, Juliana wasn't straining to hear footsteps in a dark hallway or constantly looking over her shoulder. For the first time in 6 months, they were safe. And that feeling of safety had a very high price. It was a price being paid by Adriano Silva, likely in blood. Juliana closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath, her whisper barely disturbing the quiet air of the hotel room. "I am so sorry." She was sorry for whatever terrible events were about to unfold because of her. She was sorry for the brutal violence that she knew was certainly coming. She was sorry that her own desperation had managed to pull a dangerous man like Adriano Silva into the wreckage of her life. But she was not sorry enough to leave this room, because her daughters were finally sleeping soundly, and at this moment, that was worth more than her own conscience. Miles away, across the city, inside a cold warehouse that smelled of gasoline and damp concrete, Adriano Silva stood before 2 men who were securely tied to heavy metal chairs. Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo. They had been pathetically easy to locate, far too easy. They were sloppy men, arrogant men who foolishly believed they were completely untouchable. Adriano began to walk slowly around them, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing in the vast, empty space. $43,000, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a dangerous edge. That is the amount you told Juliana Molina that her deceased husband still owed you. Gregor's left eye was already swollen completely shut. Tommy's nose was clearly broken. Neither of the 2 men said a single word. "Now, here is the part that I find so interesting," Adriano continued, his tone remaining deceptively conversational. "I took the liberty of checking your math. David Molina borrowed a total of $8,000. The work truck that you repossessed from his widow was worth at least $12,000. The small house you forced her out of was worth $90,000. He came to a stop so he was standing directly in front of them, his gaze cold and hard. "So, according to my calculations, you did not simply collect on a debt. You committed theft against a grieving widow and her 2 small children, and after all that, you had the incredible audacity to tell her that she still owed you more money." Tommy defiantly spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete floor. "We were operating on our own," he mumbled through swollen lips. Adriano's voice dropped, becoming a low growl. "You were using my name," he finished for him. "You were using my reputation to terrorize defenseless women and children." He leaned down, bringing his face so close to Tommy's that they were almost touching. "You broke the rules," Adriano said, his voice now a soft, lethal whisper. "And the rules exist for a very important reason." Gregor finally found his voice, which was raspy with fear. "Silva, please. We had no idea she was one of yours." Adriano straightened up to his full height. "She is now," he said with chilling finality. "And so is every other widow that you have terrorized." He then pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Bring me the files," he said simply into the receiver. A few moments later, Rico walked into the warehouse carrying a very thick file folder. Adriano took it from him and opened it on a nearby table. It was filled with page after page of names, addresses, and the specific amounts of money that had been collected. They were all widows. They were all single mothers. They were all victims of the unchecked greed of Gregor and Tommy. "You are going to pay back every single dollar you stole," Adriano announced, his voice like ice. "And you will be paying with interest." He then allowed a slow smile to spread across his face. It was not a kind or forgiving smile in any way. After that, he added, we are going to have a very long conversation about consequences. The entire warehouse fell completely silent, the only sound being the soft whisper of snow falling against the cold metal roof. And outside, in a warm and comfortable hotel room, Juliana Molina slept soundly and peacefully for the first time in 6 very long months. The first light of morning filtered gently through the hotel room curtains, casting a soft, golden glow across the room. Juliana woke up slowly, feeling disoriented for a moment, unsure of where she was. Then she felt the incredible softness beneath her. It was a real mattress with clean sheets and wonderful warmth. And then she remembered everything: the diner, Adriano Silva, the $300, and room 212. She sat up in bed as carefully as she could, not wanting to disturb her sleeping children. Chloe and Palmer were still curled up together in the other bed, their little faces looking completely peaceful. Their breathing was deep and even, a rhythm of pure tranquility. They had managed to sleep through the whole night without waking up even once. There had been no nightmares, no sudden crying, no trembling in their sleep. A wave of powerful emotion tightened Juliana's chest. She quietly slipped out of bed and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The street below was calm and quiet. A few cars drove by. A man was walking his dog. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal, but Juliana understood the truth now. She knew that somewhere out of sight, Adriano's men were still there, watching over them, protecting them. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the bathroom. A long, hot shower. She could not even remember the last time she had enjoyed such a luxury. 20 minutes later, she stepped out of the steam-filled room feeling like a different person, almost human again. Her hair was clean, her skin was warm, and the constant tension in her muscles had finally started to relax for the first time in months. She found some clean clothes in her bag, which were wrinkled but still serviceable, and dressed in the quiet room. The twins were beginning to stir now, their small bodies stretching under the covers, their eyes slowly blinking open to the new day. "Mama?" Chloe's voice was soft and still heavy with sleep. A gentle voice whispered, breaking through the heavy fog of sleep. "I am here, my love. It is all right." Palmer sat up abruptly, his small face a mask of confusion, as his eyes darted around the unfamiliar space. "Where are we, Mama?" "A place where the cold cannot find us," Juliana replied, her voice a fragile promise as she perched on the edge of the bed. "We are in a safe, warm place now." Her hands moved with a practiced maternal grace, helping them wash their faces and get into clean clothes. But her mind was a storm of unanswered questions. What truly happened last night? What violence did Adriano unleash to secure this sanctuary? She forced the thoughts down, building a wall against them. She did not want the answers. She could not bear to know. A sharp rap on the door shattered the quiet, and she froze. Both Chloe and Palmer went instantly still, their bodies coiling with a fear that was far too old for their years. Juliana's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as she crept toward the door, her breath held tight. Peering through the small peephole, she saw Rico standing there, holding a simple paper bag and a cardboard carrier of drinks. A shaky, relieved breath escaped her lips as she opened the door, leaving the security chain firmly in place. "Mrs. Molina," Rico's tone was formal, respectful. "Mr. Silva sent me with breakfast for you." He lifted the bag, and the warm, comforting scent of fresh coffee and buttery pastries slipped through the opening, a cruel reminder of how hungry they all were. Her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. For a long moment, words completely failed her. The simple act of kindness felt like a trap, and she did not know how to respond. "Thank you," she finally managed to say. Rico carefully set the bag and the drink carrier on the floor just outside the door. "He also sent this for you." He then placed a thick, plain manila envelope directly on top of the food. Juliana's eyes locked onto it, a fresh wave of anxiety washing over her. "What is that?" "It contains information," Rico stated, his face giving nothing away. "And it includes instructions. Mr. Silva will provide a full explanation when he arrives to see you." Juliana's heart leaped into her throat. "He is coming here? He will be here in approximately 1 hour." Rico's expression was a perfect, unreadable mask of professionalism. "He wishes to speak with you personally." Before Juliana could form another question, Rico gave a slight nod, turned, and walked silently down the long hallway. She waited, motionless, until he vanished around the distant corner. Then she quickly unlatched the chain, gathered the food, drinks, and the mysterious envelope. After shutting the door, she engaged every lock. Chloe and Palmer were staring at her, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. "Who was that man, Mama?" Palmer asked. She offered the only word she could think of, a word that felt both true and utterly false. "He is a friend. He brought us something to eat." At the mention of food, the twins' faces brightened with genuine relief. Inside the bag, they discovered fresh croissants, individual fruit cups, yogurts, and small cartons of orange juice. It was real food, good food, a treasure beyond imagining. They all ate together. They sat huddled on one of the large beds, the television playing cartoons at a low volume, a small bubble of normalcy in a world that had been anything but normal. Chloe and Palmer chattered with the simple joy of children, talking about the funny shows, the unbelievably soft beds, and how wonderfully warm the room was. It was the sound of a normal childhood conversation, a sound that made Juliana's eyes burn with fresh tears she refused to let fall. She blinked them away fiercely. Once they had finished every last crumb, she reached for the manila envelope, her hands unsteady. It was filled with official-looking papers, legal documents that felt heavy with significance. The words on the very first page made her breath catch in her throat. Notice of debt cancellation. This document hereby certifies that all outstanding debts previously attributed to David Molina, deceased, are declared null and void. No further attempts at collection will be made against Juliana Molina or her dependents. The signature at the bottom was stark and powerful. Adriano Silva, on behalf of Silva Enterprises. Juliana's hands shook violently as she continued to leaf through the subsequent pages. There were bank statements detailing the original loan of $8,000. She saw receipts for their repossessed truck, which had been valued at $12,000, followed by the terrifying documentation of their home's seizure, valued at $90,000. The final page was a cold, brutal calculation. It showed that Gregor and Tommy had not only collected the entire debt, but had unjustly profited by nearly $60,000. And at the very bottom, a note was written in neat, precise script. You owed them nothing. You were the one who was stolen from. This situation has been corrected. Juliana pressed a hand hard against her mouth, desperately trying to stifle the sob that was tearing its way up from her soul. Almost exactly 1 hour later, another knock came. Juliana had been bracing for it, but her body still reacted with a jolt of fear, her hands trembling as she approached and opened the door. Adriano Silva was standing in the hallway. He was dressed in a different suit, a charcoal gray one this time, tailored to perfection. He looked just as he had the night before, a figure of immense power, absolute control, and undeniable danger. Yet, when she looked into his eyes, she saw something different. They seemed softer and held a deep, profound exhaustion. "Mrs. Molina," he said, his voice a quiet murmur. "May I please come in?" Juliana's gaze flickered back to her twin daughters, who were absorbed in the brightly colored cartoons on the television. She gave a small nod and moved aside to let him pass. Adriano stepped inside, and his formidable presence seemed to consume all the air in the small motel room. His eyes fell upon Chloe and Palmer, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of control slipped. Something unreadable, almost like a deep sorrow, crossed his features. "Girls," he said. and his voice was surprisingly warm, almost gentle. Would you mind watching your shows for just a little while longer? Your mother and I have some things we need to discuss. The twins glanced toward Juliana for permission, and she nodded her assurance. Adriano waited patiently until their attention was once more captured by the screen. Then he turned to give Juliana his complete, undivided focus. You have read the documents. It was a statement, not a question. Juliana could only nod, the words trapped in her throat. Then you understand that you are finally free, Adriano continued, his voice low and steady. The debt has been completely erased. Gregor and Tommy will not be troubling you or your daughters again. Not ever. The question tore from her lips before she could stop it. What have you done to them? Adriano's severe expression did not shift in the slightest. I simply corrected an error in their accounting. A mistake they made. Did you have them killed? No. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. But I have made certain they fully comprehend the severe consequences of their choices and their actions. From now on, they will be repaying every single widow they have ever stolen from, and they will do so with significant interest. And if they should ever consider stepping out of line again. He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished and heavy with unspoken violence. He did not need to complete the thought. The threat was perfectly clear. Juliana swallowed against the dryness in her throat, her mind reeling. Why are you doing all of this for us? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You do not owe us a single thing. Adriano remained silent for a long, heavy moment, his gaze distant. Then, he finally spoke. When I was only 7 years old, my mother was made a widow. My father was killed during a terrible construction accident. Not long after, men came to our door. They were men who claimed my father owed them a great deal of money. They stripped our home of everything we owned, taking our furniture, even taking the food from our kitchen. They would have taken our home too, if my mother had not. He paused, his jaw clenching with a remembered pain. She was forced to do things that no mother should ever have to do, just to keep a roof over our heads and keep us safe. And on that day, I made a promise to myself. I swore that if I ever gained power, I would never, ever allow that to happen to another woman, or to another child. Juliana felt a burning sensation in her throat, the sting of unshed tears. So this is your way of finding what? Redemption? No. Adriano's voice was firm, cutting through her assumption. This is a correction. Men like Gregor and Tommy are allowed to exist only because good people do nothing to stop them. Because the world simply looks the other way. I do not look away. He reached inside his suit jacket and produced a simple, elegant business card. If anyone ever threatens you or your children again, absolutely anyone, you are to call that number. It does not matter if it is day or night. Someone will come. She accepted the card, her fingers shaking so much she could barely hold it. I cannot, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. I cannot be in debt to you. I will not owe another man. You do not owe me anything, Adriano interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. A mother who is protecting her children is never a burden to anyone. It is the single most important duty in the entire world. His dark eyes held hers, his gaze intense and unwavering, stripping away her defenses. You are not a charity case, Mrs. Molina. You are not a debt to be paid. You are a woman who deserves to live her life completely free from fear. And I am a man who possesses the power to make that a reality. Juliana could no longer stop the tears. They streamed freely down her face, hot and cleansing. I do not know how I can ever thank you for this. Do not thank me. Adriano's voice softened to a quiet command. Just take care of your daughters. Give them the life that they so richly deserve. That is all the thanks I will ever require. He turned and moved toward the door. But then he paused, his hand on the knob. This room has been paid for the next 2 weeks. After that time, there is an apartment waiting for you. The first and last month's rent has already been covered. It is located in a safe neighborhood. There are good schools nearby. Juliana's breath hitched in her chest. I cannot possibly accept that. You can, Adriano said, looking back at her one last time. And you will. You will do it for them. And then, he was gone. Juliana remained standing in the silent center of the room, clutching the small, stiff business card as if it were a lifeline, while tears of shock and relief poured down her face. Behind her, she heard Chloe's small, innocent voice. Mama, why are you crying? Juliana turned and gathered both of her precious girls into a fierce, protective embrace, burying her face in their hair. Because we are safe now, my loves, she whispered against their heads, her voice thick with emotion. We are finally, truly safe. 2 entire days had passed since Adriano Silva had walked out of room 212. It had been 2 days of Juliana waking from a peaceful sleep in a real bed, not the cold floor of a truck. 2 days of setting out real meals for her daughters, watching them eat until they were full. 2 days of hearing them laugh without constantly glancing over her own shoulder in terror. For 2 long days, she had been slowly, cautiously allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their unending nightmare was actually over. She was at the window now, watching as Chloe and Palmer played together in the small, snow-covered courtyard behind the inn. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, and the twins were busy building a wonderfully lopsided snowman. The sound of their pure, happy laughter drifted up to the second-floor window. It was the sound of real laughter, the unburdened, joyful noise that only comes from children who believe with all their hearts that they are safe from harm. Juliana pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window pane, her warm breath fogging the surface. She had not laid eyes on Adriano since that fateful morning. However, she had definitely seen his men, though they were different individuals each day. They were always kept at a respectable distance, always watching over them. They never once approached her, and they never spoke a single word. They simply existed on the periphery of her new, fragile life, like silent, ever-present guardians. By all rights, their constant presence should have felt intrusive, even threatening. Instead, it felt like she was finally able to take a full, deep breath for the first time in many, many months. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Juliana's shoulders went rigid with an automatic tension. It seemed old habits were hard to break, but when she checked the peephole, her body relaxed upon seeing Rico standing there once more. She opened the door without hesitation. Mrs. Molina. He held out a simple set of keys on a plain silver ring. The apartment is now ready for you and your daughters. Juliana stared down at the keys, her mind struggling to process the reality of them. They looked so solid, so real. She half expected them to bite her. Already? Mr. Silva does not believe in wasting time. Rico's expression was, as always, professionally neutral and unreadable. It is fully furnished. The utilities have been activated. We have stocked the refrigerator. The girls' room has been set up with bunk beds, and we have provided some toys. Juliana's throat tightened with an overwhelming wave of emotion. He truly thought of everything. He always does, Rico confirmed, placing the keys firmly into her palm. The address is on the tag. When you decide to move, someone will be assigned to help you with your belongings. Juliana's voice was barely a whisper when she answered, I do not have any belongings. Everything I still possess can fit inside a single bag. A muscle in Rico's jaw twitched, a nearly invisible reaction. In that case, he said, someone will assist you in carrying your bag. He started to walk away, but then stopped. Mrs. Molina, Mr. Silva instructed me to pass along a message to you. What is it? He wanted me to remind you that his protection is not an act of charity, but an act of correction. Rico looked directly into her eyes. You have not done anything to deserve what happened. You are not taking advantage of anyone. You are simply receiving the care that you should have been given all along. Before Juliana could even form a reply, he had already left. She remained standing in the doorway, the sharp edges of the keys pressing into her palm, and she realized with a start that she was crying once more. They moved into the new residence later that afternoon. It was located on the third story of a meticulously kept building, situated in a part of town Juliana had only ever passed through in a car. It was the type of neighborhood where trees formed a canopy over the streets and children played freely on the sidewalks. The sidewalks were clean, and the Christmas decorations hanging from the windows looked genuinely expensive. It was the kind of neighborhood where people like her were never meant to live. But now, somehow, she did. Rico carried her lone duffel bag up the 3 flights of stairs while Juliana carefully guided Chloe and Palmer, one by each hand. The moment he turned the key, unlocked the front door, and swung it inward, both of the twins let out a collective gasp of wonder. The apartment was absolutely beautiful. It was not lavish or ostentatious, but it was filled with an undeniable warmth. In the living room, there was a plush, comfortable couch and a television. The kitchen featured a full-size refrigerator that emitted a soft, steady hum. There were 2 separate bedrooms. The first held a double bed and a matching dresser, while the other was furnished with cheerful pink bunk beds and a large toy chest that was overflowing with dolls and an assortment of stuffed animals. Chloe and Palmer immediately dashed into their new room, their squeals of pure joy echoing through the apartment. Juliana stood motionless just inside the entryway, completely frozen. "This is far too much," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Rico gently placed her bag on the floor next to the couch. "Mr. Silva does not think so. But I cannot accept this." "You can." Rico's tone was firm, yet held no trace of harshness. "And you will, because those little girls deserve a stable home, and you deserve to have some peace in your life." He walked toward the exit, but then he paused again. "There is just one more thing." He motioned toward a small security panel mounted on the wall near the entrance. "This device is linked directly into our private network. If you ever begin to feel unsafe, if any trouble ever arises, you press that red button. I guarantee someone will be at your door in under 3 minutes." Juliana could only stare at the small, glowing panel. "So you are going to be watching this apartment all the time." Rico's expression was completely serious and matter-of-fact. "Mr. Silva always protects what belongs to him. And now, you belong to him." With those final words, he departed, pulling the door closed with a soft click behind him. Juliana stood alone in the center of her new living room, listening to the sound of her daughters laughing with delight in the adjacent room. She felt the crushing weight of the last 6 months, finally, slowly, begin to lift off her shoulders. That evening, long after the twins had fallen fast asleep in their brand new bunk beds, Juliana sat on the edge of her own bed and took out the simple business card Adriano had pressed into her hand. It had only a single phone number printed on it. There was no name, no company logo, just a lifeline. She slowly traced her thumb across the raised, embossed numbers, her thoughts consumed by the man who had offered it to her. He was a known criminal, a man who dealt in violence, a person whose very name could make powerful men fall silent with a deep-seated fear. Despite all of that, he had been the one to save her. He did it not because he desired something from her, not because he was looking for gratitude or demanded loyalty or expected anything at all in return. He did it because he could still remember the pain of watching his own mother suffer. Juliana squeezed her eyes shut and whispered into the silent room, "Thank you." The words felt utterly inadequate, completely insufficient to convey her gratitude, but they were the only words she had. Far across the city, inside an office that provided a commanding view of the darkened streets below, Adriano Silva was seated behind a massive desk buried under stacks of files. There were files on Gregor and Tommy, files on every last rogue debt collector that dared to operate within his territory, and files on widows and single mothers who had been systematically terrorized, robbed blind, and completely destroyed. He had been working without rest for 48 straight hours. Rico came into the room without knocking first. "She is settled in now. The girls seem happy. There were no problems at all." Adriano gave a single, sharp nod, his eyes never leaving the documents in front of him. "And what about the others?" Rico asked, his tone cautious. "All of the other collectors are being dealt with." Adriano's voice was as cold as ice. "Every single widow will receive full restitution for what was taken. Every single illegal debt is being completely erased. Every man who took part in this has been given a choice. They can either make it right, or they can simply disappear. Some of them will not choose wisely. I am counting on it." Adriano finally lifted his head, and his eyes were as hard and unforgiving as stone. "That will be their problem, not mine." Rico hesitated for a moment. "Boss, what you are doing for her, for Juliana, this is more than just a simple correction. You must know that, right?" Adriano remained silent for a long, heavy moment. Then he finally spoke. "When I was just a boy, I had to watch my mother plead with men exactly like Gregor and Tommy, begging them for mercy. I watched her cry every night. I watched her spirit break into a million pieces, and I could not do a single thing to stop it from happening." His hands on the desk clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. "I made a promise to myself that I would never be that powerless ever again. I swore that if I ever gained the ability to stop men like that, I would do it, regardless of the cost." And Juliana. Juliana served as a reminder of why I made that promise in the first place. Adriano's voice was quiet, but it carried an absolute, unbreakable finality. "She is not a charity case. She is not a debt to be collected. She is the living proof that my promise still means something." Rico gave a slow, understanding nod. "The men have been asking questions. They want to know why you are protecting a random widow. They are wondering what she means to you. Let them ask their questions." Adriano's eyes were like chips of flint. "And if any of them have a problem with my decision, they are welcome to bring that problem directly to me. No one ever would. Every single one of them knew better than to challenge him." Rico turned to go, but paused with his hand on the doorknob. "For what it is worth, boss, I believe you did the right thing here." Adriano offered no reply. He simply went back to his files, continuing to work deep into the night, methodically ensuring that every woman Gregor and Tommy had utterly destroyed would be made whole once more. Because he knew that power without a clear purpose was nothing more than pointless cruelty. And Adriano Silva refused to be a cruel man. Not to people who were unable to fight for themselves. Not to mothers who were just trying to protect their children. And especially not to women who reminded him of the one person he had failed to save, his own mother. She had died when he was only 15 years old. She died still afraid, still buried in debt, and still completely broken. He could not save her back then, but he could save Juliana now, and for the time being, that would have to be enough. Spring finally arrived, appearing tentative and soft, as if it were painting the entire city with delicate shades of green and a pale, hopeful pink. Juliana stood by the window of her small, sun-drenched apartment, carefully watching as Chloe and Palmer played a game of hopscotch on the clean sidewalk down below. The sound of their laughter, so bright and completely unburdened, floated up to her through the open window like a beautiful piece of music. Even now, she found it difficult to believe this was her life. 3 full months had gone by since that terrifying, frozen Christmas Eve. 3 months of feeling completely safe. 3 months of taking slow, steady breaths without fear. The apartment was provided by Adriano, but over time, it had started to feel like it was truly hers. It was a modest place, just a 2-bedroom apartment on a quiet street, but it was always clean, it was warm, and most importantly, it was their own private sanctuary. The security panel next to the door glowed with a soft, constant green light, a silent promise of safety that had gradually transformed from a reminder of her fear into a source of genuine comfort. Juliana had even managed to find a job, not cleaning under the table for cash, but a real position with a real paycheck at a lovely florist shop just 2 blocks away. Mrs. Gable, the sweet elderly woman who owned the shop, had taken just one look at Juliana's careful, gentle hands and her tired but deeply determined eyes, and had hired her right on the spot. "You have the look of a person who truly understands just how precious and fragile beautiful things can be," she had told her with a knowing smile. The twins had started attending the local school. On their very first day, they had clung tightly to Juliana's legs, their little faces pale with an anxiety that was born from experiencing too many sudden, terrifying moves in the middle of the night. But by that afternoon, they had come home clutching colorful construction paper drawings and telling excited stories about a very nice teacher they had named Miss Amy. Now they chattered endlessly about their new friends and their homework, their entire world expanding far beyond the four walls of fear that they had been forced to live inside for such a long time. It was a completely normal life, a precious and beautifully ordinary life, and all of it was built upon a quiet and unseen foundation of constant protection. Juliana never once saw Adriano, but she could feel his presence in the calm stability of her everyday life. Rico would appear once every month, always on a Tuesday morning, to hand-deliver a plain white envelope. It never contained any cash. Instead, it held a grocery store gift card, a receipt for a prepaid utility bill, or a voucher for new children's clothes. The money came from the investments of Mr. Silva. Rico would deliver this news in his quiet, professional voice. He was clear that the funds were to be shared. In the beginning, Juliana fought against accepting it. She told him she could not continue to take his money. She had her own job now and could provide for her family. But Rico's response was a simple, unmoving stare, his face impossible to read. He told her the debt was never her responsibility, Mrs. Molina. This was not about paying someone back. He called it a restoration of what was unfairly taken. He urged her to let his employer do this for her. This is a story about how absolute power can be used to shield the powerless from harm. Keep listening to understand how a monster became an angel for one desperate family. And so, she finally agreed. With every week that passed, the tight, cold knot of terror that lived in her chest began to unwind, little by little. Her shoulders lowered from their constant state of tension around her ears. She could breathe again without the feeling of a heavy weight pressing down on her lungs. One particular evening, she sat with Palmer, patiently guiding her through a reading lesson. In the background, the television flickered with the evening news. A well-dressed anchor spoke with a serious tone. He discussed a major reorganization happening in some business circles that were not being named. He mentioned a severe crackdown on illegal and predatory lending operations. The report was deliberately short on details, using unnamed sources to build its case. But it did confirm that a number of people had suddenly fled the city. Juliana's hand froze over the page of Palmer's book. She did not need to hear any names to understand. She already knew exactly who they were talking about. She felt a chill, but it was not from fear. It was the shocking realization that someone immensely powerful had acted on her behalf. A dangerous man had shown an unexpected and profound compassion. Her fear was rapidly being replaced by a strange and unfamiliar feeling of safety. Later that evening, while tucking her daughters into bed, Chloe turned to her with wide, serious blue eyes. She asked in a small voice, "Mama, is the scary man still watching over us?" Juliana's hand paused as she gently smoothed her daughter's soft hair away from her forehead. A lump formed in her throat. She had to choose her words with great care, to explain a complex truth to an innocent child who deserved to feel secure. "He is not scary, my sweet girl," Juliana whispered, her voice full of a feeling she could not quite name. "Not to us, anyway." Chloe considered this for a moment and then asked, "Is he an angel?" Juliana's throat tightened again, and she had to swallow hard before she could speak. "No, sweetheart, he is not an angel." She explained that he was simply a man who clearly remembered what it felt like to be helpless when other people were being cruel. He was a man who had gained the power to make it stop, and for them, he had decided to use it. The system had failed them, but this man had built a new one just for their protection. That single act revealed a world of hidden corruption and the quiet, forceful justice that moved against it. The system had failed many others too. That night, long after the twins had drifted off to sleep, Juliana went to her jewelry box. She pulled out the plain business card that Adriano had given her. She had never once used the phone number printed on it, but she kept it safe, like a sacred charm, a reminder of the night her world broke into two separate pieces, the time before and the time after. She thought about him then, not as the feared mafia boss whose presence could drain all the sound from a room, but as the young boy he must have been once. A boy who had no choice but to watch his own mother break under pressure. A man who constructed an entire kingdom out of fear, only to use its formidable walls to protect a stranger and her two children from a raging storm. It was a paradox she could not solve, so she had long ago stopped trying to understand it. Some debts can never be recorded or balanced in a financial ledger. These kinds of debts are settled in the peaceful silence of a safe home. They are paid in the gentle sound of children sleeping without nightmares, and in the profound relief of a mother who no longer has to constantly look over her shoulder in fear. She moved toward the window and gazed down at the quiet, calm street below. A black sedan was parked neatly under a streetlight about 2 blocks away from her building. There was always one there. The car was different each time, parked in a new spot, but its presence was constant and unwavering. A long time ago, the sight of it would have sent an icy chill down her spine. Now she felt only a deep and humbling sense of gratitude. Adriano Silva had not offered her charity, he had given her back her very life, and in the process of doing that, he had perhaps rebuilt a small, broken piece of himself. It was not redemption, she knew. It was likely a fragment of the powerless boy he once was, now holding immense power and using it with a clear purpose. That purpose, in its own stark and brutal way, was a kind of mercy. Juliana rested her palm against the cold glass of the window. Somewhere out there in the sprawling city, he was moving through the shadows, enforcing his own harsh and violent code of justice. But because that code existed, her daughters were safe. Because of his rules, they were happily coloring at the kitchen table. Because of his power, she could finally make plans for a future that was not filled with dread. The nightmare had truly ended. Morning had finally arrived, and the man who lived his life in darkness had been the one to switch on the light for her. 5 Christmases came and went. The old, worn-out diner was gone. A modern cafe with a sleek glass front now stood in its place. Juliana stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, her gloved hands holding onto 2 other hands that were larger and warmer now. Chloe and Palmer, who were now 10 years old, were buzzing with the excitement of the holidays. Their warm breaths created small white clouds in the frosty air. "It looks so different," Palmer observed, her voice no longer the timid whisper of a frightened child, but something clear and full of light. "Everything looks different when you are not scared anymore," Chloe added, speaking with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Juliana squeezed their hands tightly, a wave of love washing over her. They had made this trip every single Christmas Eve, not because they owed a debt, but because they needed to remember. Their life was now wonderfully, beautifully normal. The apartment had transformed into a true home, filled with messy school projects, music that was always played a little too loud, and the comfortable mess that comes with a happy family. Juliana was now the manager of the local florist shop. The festive scent of fresh pine and warm cinnamon from the holiday wreaths they had created that very morning still clung to her warm winter coat. They continued their walk, heading toward their new holiday tradition, getting hot chocolate at the fancy cafe that had replaced the diner. As they went by a newsstand, a headline on a financial magazine grabbed Juliana's attention. It read, "Silva Enterprises, the reclusive billionaire reshaping cities." Beneath the large text was a grainy, long-distance photograph of a man in a dark overcoat climbing into a car. It was Adriano. He was older, with streaks of silver now visible at his temples. His face was as impassive and tightly controlled as she remembered. To the rest of the world, he was a legend wrapped in mystery and shadow. He was a billionaire philanthropist who was rumored to have much darker connections. He was a man who controlled boardrooms and, as the whispers insisted, still controlled the streets with fear. But to Juliana, he was the memory of a sudden, deafening silence that had fallen over a noisy diner. He was the heavy weight of a powerful gaze that had truly seen her suffering and had refused to turn away. He was the sole reason her daughters now understood safety as a basic right, not as a desperate, miraculous gift. "Are you okay, Mama?" Palmer asked, her eyes following her mother's gaze to the magazine cover. "I am perfect," Juliana replied, and she meant it with her whole heart. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last word. This story carries a message worth remembering. True power is not found in what you can take from the world, but in what you choose to give back. Sometimes the darkest moments of our lives are exactly where we discover that we were never truly alone, and that mercy, even from the most unlikely source, can be the greatest force on earth. If this story touched your heart, do me a small favor. Hit that like button, leave a comment rating this story from 1 to 10, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, tap that subscribe button so you never miss another story. Your support means more than you know. Now tap the next video on your screen. I promise, another powerful journey is waiting for you. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories and valuable life lessons to our audience.